Well, good morning, everybody. For those of you that are watching live, I'm sorry about the false start, but we are here now anyway, and it's good to see you again this morning. The last few days we've been looking at Jesus and what he says about himself, the I am sayings of Jesus. He said, lots of people have said lots of things about Jesus, but what we want to do over these mornings is we're looking at what Jesus said about himself. What did he claim about himself? And we've already seen some amazing things, really. Jesus just taking ordinary things like bread and light, and then in the things that they would have known out in the countryside, a sheepfold. And today he's going to talk, we're staying in the sheepfold, if you like, we're staying out in the fields as we kind of, Jesus takes on this story of who he is. And the story today is in John chapter 10. Now, if you've got a Bible and you want to follow that, John chapter 10 from verse 11. And we find Jesus out there. I mean, I love being out in the countryside. That's one of the things I love to do. Go walking and seeing them. And if you ever watched a shepherd with the sheep, looking after their sheep, and the way they round them up and the way they look after them, it's an incredible experience, isn't it? And it's really evident that there's a real oneness about them all, in a sense, and shepherds really care for their sheep. A good shepherd really does. And I read a while ago about a girl who was just in her 20s, I think, but she was living on the Wirral, just as an ordinary girl, going to university, doing different things, going to get a normal job in a city type thing, but she just really had a hankering to go to the countryside and to be a shepherd, if you like. So she went up to the Lake District for a couple of weeks on holiday, worked on a farm for a bit, and absolutely got the bug. And now she's often on Country File on the Saturdays and on the weekends and what have you, as a shepherdess or a shepherd up in the Lake District. And you know, evidence that she just loves the sheep and loves the job that she does so much. That's a good shepherd, isn't it? And that's what it should be. And Jesus' claim this morning is that he is the good shepherd. John chapter 10 and verse 11 says, Jesus said, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd who lays down his life for his sheep. And he says a number of other things which we'll look at this morning as we go through. So Jesus, the good shepherd. Now remember the context of all of this. If you were with us yesterday, you'll know this. But if not, I'll remind you, the last couple of days we've actually talked about this. Jesus, around this time, they'd had the feast of celebrating the harvest, and they just celebrated that in the temple. And as part of that, an event that happened of that, Jesus talked about himself being the light of the world. And then he talked, just after that, he healed a man who had been born blind. And this man had been begging all his life out in the streets. The Jewish leaders at the time, the elites, if you like, the senior leaders of Israel, and they were religious men generally, just didn't like the idea that Jesus was claiming to be some of these things, that he was the source of light, that he was the bread of life, and so he was the light of the world. And they didn't really like any of that. It was challenging to them. And Jesus had said, you know, that yesterday so Jesus talking about he's the door, he's the only way into God's kingdom, the kingdom that they thought that they were in. God's kingdom's like a sheepfold, he's saying, and he used what they would all recognise because farming was very, common in Palestine at that time. God's kingdom's like a sheepfold. My Father's kingdom. He kept referring to God as his Father. And they just didn't like that at all, and they struggled with it. So you've got the blind man then comes and is healed, and Jesus healed him, and he says he's a man from heaven. And all they could do was hurl insults at him. And Jesus confronted them in yesterday's talk, and when we were talking about the door, and he said, you're meant to be the true shepherds of Israel. You're meant to be the ones that look after the flock of God's people, Israel. And yet you're not doing it. You're kicking them out of the kingdom and you're insulting them. The poor and the crippled, the lame and the blind, you don't bother with them. So Jesus had all of this. And then he goes on today. So it's in that context that this conversation takes place. Now, we don't know whether Jesus was out in the fields or whatever, or he could see the fields from there. But he knew that these people would all know what he was talking about. So he said he was the door. But then he goes on to say, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd, as opposed to the bad shepherds, the poor shepherds, of Israel, as he was saying. So again, he's saying, I'm the good shepherd. Before we really look at what that means, because the focus is what Jesus is saying, we need to understand a little bit about sheep as well. Sheep are not the brightest of animals. You may well have heard that before. I'm sure you probably have. Sheep aren't the brightest of animals, and so what they'll do is they'll be in a field and they'll be eating the grass and the grazing in the field. When that runs out, they would just stay there. They wouldn't find, there might be grass in a field just along the way, and they could see it, but they wouldn't think to go there. They would just stay where they are, and in the end, they would just die. They're always prone to wander. They don't realise danger, so they often fall over the edge of cliffs and things, or down ravines. They don't see the danger coming of wild animals and things that could attack them. And so sheep are lost. They're prone to wander. They're prone to get stuck in all sorts of places. And they need a shepherd. Sheep without a shepherd. Jesus mentioned that as he looked at the world in another part of the New Testament, Jesus looked at people around and he was moved with compassion for them. Why? Because he said these people are like sheep without a shepherd. They're lost. They don't know what's best for them. They're wandering into all kinds of danger. They don't see the danger that's surrounding them, and they're heading for disaster. And that's what, in a sense, he's saying here. And that's what we need to think about with sheep. That's what they're like. And so the shepherd would take care of the sheep, and the shepherd would have a relationship with the sheep. We'll see that in a second. But in a sense of, he cared a lot because they were part of his livelihood, and one sheep being lost was one too many. And so elsewhere, Jesus tells the story about going 99 sheep in the fold, and he goes and finds the one that's lost if he had 100. It was very, very important. And so there's a close bond, if you like, almost between the sheep and the shepherd. And the sheep have to rely on the shepherd. They don't realise how good the shepherd is for them. But he leads them and they know him, as we saw yesterday, as we'll see again this morning. Sometimes the shepherd has to be very disciplined with the sheep, and part of it sounds very cruel really, but if a sheep continues to wander off and get lost, what the shepherd used to do was break its legs and then carry the sheep around until the legs healed, and then when that sheep was able to walk again, it would never wander too far away from the shepherd. So, it could be brutal, it could be difficult at times, and the discipline that the shepherd gave to the sheep wasn't always easy to take, but it was for the best in the end. Now, of course, there's huge pictures here for our relationship, if you like, with Jesus, and what Jesus was saying. I am the good, the best shepherd who lays down his life for the sheep. That's an interesting one, isn't it? Jesus laying down his life for the sheep. Obviously, he's referring, we know, to his death. He's thinking of the time when he would physically give his life for us as his sheep. Shepherds would put themselves in harm's way. A good shepherd would put himself in harm's way to protect his sheep. So we read about David, who was one of the most famous shepherds in the Bible. He with his slingshot, he was able to kill a lion and a bear, apparently, and rescued his sheep from being attacked. Because, as I say, it was so important, it was a livelihood. So a good shepherd would do that. A hired hand, Jesus goes on in this little passage in John 10 to talk about a hired hand, and often they would have hired people who would come in, and they weren't their sheep, and if the first sign of trouble, like a lion or a bear or anything else, they'd just clear off. They wouldn't be there. They're only concerned about themselves. And I guess Jesus, being the good shepherd, is comparing himself still with these Pharisees and these leaders, and who are saying they're the ones you should follow. They're putting themselves out there as being the ones we should follow, and yet when it comes down to it, they only care about themselves. Now, I'll leave you to draw the conclusions and draw the connections to society today and our leaders and what have you. That's entirely in your hands. But Jesus is the good shepherd who will lay down his life for the sheep, a willing shepherd, because he sees sheep without a shepherd that are lost and in danger, and he's prepared to go the extra mile for their sheep. He's a willing shepherd. It's important. That's why he's a good shepherd. And he goes on to say, he knows, he says, Jesus says further on, I know my sheep and they know me. And it kind of refers back to yesterday when we were talking about when the sheep are in the sheepfold, the shepherd, they know the shepherd so well that the shepherd, often there'd be lots of different flocks of sheep in the sheepfold, just sheltering, and the shepherd would go and call his own sheep out, and they would reckon, and only his sheep would come. A sheep would never follow a stranger. only somebody who they knew and they trusted. And he would call them out, and he would lead them. And he would lead them out into pastures. He would be the one that would find the pasture for them. He'd be the one that had a shepherd's crook, and if they were wandering away, he'd use that to drag them back. He'd have a rod as well, like an iron bar almost, really, that would be there to protect them if wild animals came. It would also be there to discipline them if they needed it, but generally speaking, it would be there to protect them. The shepherd and the sheep out in the field together. That was the Middle Eastern shepherd. It's slightly different today, but there's still, if you notice the shepherds today, if you spoke to them, they really are concerned about the sheep, even the ones that are hired. They care about their well-being, and a good shepherd would at least do that. But Jesus is the best shepherd, and he gives his life for the sheep, so he leads them. And I guess the echoes of this, the other passage of scripture where we read about the shepherd, is in Psalm 23, isn't it? Remember that psalm? It's a wonder. I mean, you must have heard of that psalm. Everybody has, and we can probably many of us say it. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. It's been the comfort of so many people. And it talks about the shepherd there. David, who wrote this psalm, we talked about him before as a shepherd, he understood what this was about. And he spoke about the shepherd who, if the Lord's my shepherd, I don't lack anything because he looks after me. He takes me to the place where I needed to go. So he makes me lie down in green pastures. He gives me rest in the green pastures and gives me food to eat. He brings me to still waters, calm waters, waters where it's safe to drink. Water. So he brings me to safety and peace and calm. He restores my soul. Restore means to turn it back to what it should be. And so we know as Jesus, as our good shepherd, takes us and gets us to the place where we need to be in our soul, in our very being. He helps us to be the people that we ought to be, that he wants us to be, and to flourish. So he restores, he puts us back on the right track. That's what the shepherd, the good shepherd, does. Even if I walk through a valley of the shadow of death, the psalmist says, so even in the scary, dark places, I don't fear evil. Why? Because the shepherd is with me. He walks with me. He's gone through that death. Jesus has given his life for the sheep, so he knows what it's like. And so even in death itself, but all the other problems and scary, dark things of life, the shepherd is there. He's a good shepherd, and he walks with us. And he talks about his rod and staff that are a comfort. The rod, which is the protection, if you like, as we've already said, sometimes for discipline as well. There's a great tapestry in Bayeux of Henry comforteth his troops. I can't remember which Henry it was now, sorry about that. He comforteth his troops, it says underneath, and it's Henry comforting his troops in battle. And what he's doing is he's turned them around. He's got a pitchfork and he's making them go back the way that they should be. Funny way of comforting. But his rod and his staff comforts me. So we know his discipline, but we also know his protection, and we know his care, and we can lean on him as we go through these difficult times. And he leads us through that, even death itself, because there's a table to a feast, a table prepared for us, a feast that we've been invited to. We've got a seat at the table. If the Lord's our shepherd, he's leading us through all these things. And this is a kind of picture of heaven, if you like, really. Life beyond the grave, where we will sit and we will enjoy the finest of things, because that's what God promises us, even through death, which is why this psalm is often read at funerals, because it's the hope that we have. The Lord being the good shepherd, leading us through to these things and bringing us to the feast that we have with the finest of things, and a cup that runs over, boundless joy and boundless stores of everything for us in heaven. And that's what the shepherd promises that he'd lead us to. And it's in the presence of my enemies. In other words, justice is being done. Those who've opposed me, those who've done me wrong during this world, justice will be done. And so all of that, everything will be made right in the presence of my enemies. And so that's a great psalm, isn't it, to picture what it means for the Lord being my shepherd. But the clue is in that first line of the psalm. If the Lord is my shepherd, if Jesus is my good shepherd, I'll not want. If we hear his voice and listen to his call as he calls us out to follow him, we will lack nothing. All these promises are for us. His protection, his comfort, his leading, his guiding. We'll no longer be lost. We'll no longer be wandering. We'll no longer be in the danger because Jesus will be with us. Life might get tough. There may be valleys and there may be dark places, but he will go with us. And even through death itself. What a glorious promise that is. Because Jesus is the good shepherd who lays down his life for the sheep. Of course, we said yesterday that the reason we can know these things is because Jesus died to pay the price for our rejection of him. That means death and separation from him, and he's, if you like, his death has bridged the gap. It's paid the price to his Father in heaven, to God. If you like, the price has been paid. Our sin has been paid for, and Christ also talks in this passage about not only laying down his life but taking it up again. And that's a kind of nod, if you like, towards the resurrection. That Jesus saying, I'm in complete control, even though I have to give my life. I am the Lord, I am the resurrection and the life. And we're going to look at that saying tomorrow. But Jesus is able, even death itself, Jesus will triumph over. And if we follow him, if he's our shepherd, so will we, is what he promises. What a glorious thing to even think about there. He goes on to say as well that he's got other sheep that are not of this fold that he wants to bring in. That's an interesting one, isn't it? Again, very controversial for those Jewish leaders who thought they were the only ones that God wanted because they kept all the law and they ticked the boxes, as we were talking about yesterday. That they kept God's law and they thought they were poor. But he didn't keep it perfectly, but they thought they were. They were hypocritical in many ways and very legalistic. And Jesus says, no, I'm in complete control. I lay down my life, I pick it up again. I have other sheep of this fold that aren't with the people of Israel. And in a sense, this is kind of almost in very topical at the moment, an answer to all of an answer to racism as well. That in Christ there is no difference between skin colour and anything else. Everybody's equal in Christ. As we follow him, we're all sheep. And we're all lost, and we're all wandering, and we all need a shepherd. So together, we're all in the same boat. We have to admit that we are like lost sheep. That's the point. We have to come to him, recognising our lostness and our proneness to wander, and our need of a shepherd. Whoever we are, whatever colour of our skin is, whatever male, female, whatever, we all come in the same way. So Jesus says to these people, I have other sheep. And he's talking then about, it was Jews and Gentiles, when he's talking about everybody else. And so it's God's kingdom, God's sheepfold is inclusive for everybody. Anybody who calls on the name of the Lord, the Bible tells us, will be saved. Will have Jesus as their good shepherd. And so this is what we are promised today. This is what this statement, Jesus being the good shepherd, really means. So what do we do with it then? What do you do with it this morning? Jesus is calling you. It's as though he's coming to you and he's calling you this morning and saying, do you realise how lost you are? Do you feel lost? Do you realise how much danger that you're in? Have you looked to other shepherds, the hired hands, if you like, the leaders that are there, those in front who let us down constantly? And Jesus is saying, I am your good shepherd. I know where the best pasture lands are. I know where the green pastures are and the still waters. I'll be with you when the going gets really tough. And even through death itself, I'll walk with you. My rod and my staff, they'll be your comfort. I'm the one who gives my life for you. And I'll take it up again as well, and I'll take you with me. There is a hope for the future, even beyond the grave, with a table spread and a feast and justice done forevermore. But in order to know that, we have to accept that the Lord is the good shepherd. Jesus is our good shepherd. We have to hear his voice, and he may be calling you this morning, and we follow him. Are you hearing his voice calling you this morning? We follow him as he leads us out. He restores our soul. He brings us back to where we should be. We admit that we need him. We admit that we've messed up, and we need a shepherd. But what about you, Christian, this morning, who has been following the Lord for a while? You know his voice. He knows you. You know him. But you're still like a sheep. And we all are, aren't we? I am too. And we still wander away, and we try and find our own way. And you often see lost sheep. I remember again on one of my walks, I used to do lots of long distance walking. I still do. I love doing it. But on one particular one in Yorkshire, I remember there was we were just walking down a riverbank of sheep coming towards us, and they saw us and we saw them, and they turned tail and started walking back, and the shepherd was in the field just above the riverbank on the other side of a wall, and says, I don't know why they're doing there, but can you just keep sending them down the river and I'll get them at the other end. So I became a shepherd. It was amazing. And the sheep are terrified of me. They didn't know me. I couldn't speak to them. They weren't following me. They were running away from me. But obviously they didn't know where they were running. They'd obviously been stupid enough to get themselves, and all of them following each other. That's another thing that sheep do, is they just kind of follow the one in front. They don't think about where they're going. So they'd all got themselves in danger. Isn't that the truth with society today? And so we're prone to wander, aren't we? And eventually this shepherd gets his sheep back. But what about the one that's stuck in the fence that wanders away? Another time I was out walking, there was a sheep who had seen the water on the other side of a wire fence and stuck his head through to try and get the water and was completely stuck. And we ended up having to tell the shepherd that he needed to go and rescue that sheep. We are so stupid that we are prone to wander, even those of us who know the shepherd this morning and have proved his worth in our lives, and we know he's good. Is that you today? Are you listening to his voice? What's he saying to you today? The Lord is my shepherd. He is the good shepherd. It all hinges on that, though, isn't it? Can we truly say that the Lord is my shepherd? Because that's what matters. And if you can't say that this morning yet, you could, if you admit that you need him. You need the good shepherd who takes care of the sheep. So you come to him and you confess your need of him. You confess that you've messed up, and you come and say, I want you to be my good shepherd, leading me through life and all the things we've said this morning into the goodness and mercy that he promises all the days of our life. Well, Jesus, the good shepherd, the bread of life, the light of the world, he's the door that lets us into the kingdom of God. He said a lot of things about himself. What do you think about Jesus? How has that helped you? How has that spoken to you, perhaps? Tomorrow we're going to look at another one of Jesus' sayings. I already gave you the clue, talking about resurrection and life. So join me in the morning, 8:30 again. You'll be more than welcome to do that. I'm sorry about, as I say, the false start this morning, but it's good to see. If you're watching it later on YouTube, you probably haven't got a clue what I'm talking about. But have a good day wherever you are. And if you're with us tomorrow, I'll see you then. God bless. Bye-bye.